This video is for paper 3, political ideas, key thinker number 3 for socialism, Beatrice Webb. As always, let's talk a little bit about Webb's background prior to talking about her views on those 4 key concepts: human nature, state, society and economy. So Beatrice Webb was born in 1858, 10 years after Marx and Engels first published the Communist Manifesto. Webb is not just a politician, but a social reformer and historian. She founded the Fabian Society, which still to this day is a group connected with the Labour Party, and also LSE, the London School of Economics University. Her key text is the 1909 Minority Report. Webb was asked to research the poor laws, and the Conservative government at the time wanted to make some reforms to that. Webb's Minority Report was the minority opinion from that research group. She advocated for a welfare state to replace the poor laws. In her Minority Report, the key phrase that I've taken out from it is that the government should provide sufficient nourishment and training when young, a living wage when able-bodied, treatment when sick, and modest but secure livelihood when disabled or aged. And that idea of from the very beginning of your life to the very end, from young till aged, is something that we see in the post-war welfare state after the Beveridge Report. William Beveridge was actually a researcher for Beatrice Webb at this time, and it is he that in the 1940s talks about offering support from cradle till grave. So the Minority Report is one of the inspirations for the Beveridge Report, which comes in the 1940s, which gives us the post-war welfare state. Webb becomes a member of the Labour Party in 1914, and she helped to craft Clause 4 of the Labour Party constitution, which called for common ownership of the means of production, distribution and exchange. And that last piece of information there should be enough to tell you that we have finished looking at revolutionary socialism. From Beatrice Webb onwards, all of our key thinkers are democratic evolutionary socialists. And in fact, all 3 of them are linked to the Labour Party. So we're moving away from this revolutionary approach and more towards a democratic evolutionary means. And Webb's key idea is gradualism. That common ownership can be achieved, but needs to be done so democratically, peacefully, and gradually. I've started looking at economy first when we've done socialist key thinkers, and it was most appropriate for Marx, but I'll continue to do it as we work through just for consistency. So one thing that Webb noticed is that capitalism was chaotic. The economy could boom and bust. And this is, when she's writing this is long before the Wall Street crash of 1929, but that is a really good example in the early 20th century of the volatility of capitalism. That the 1920s was a decade of significant economic growth that suddenly and very drastically changes. So for Webb, the chaos of capitalism should and will gradually be replaced by a collectively owned economy, common ownership. Workers will then be allowed to enjoy the full benefits of their work because the means of production, the way in which things are made and manufactured and sold, will be under common ownership. And that is the way in which, for Beatrice Webb, socialism should be achieved. Now, this is the same end goal as Marx and Luxemburg, common ownership, that the state will redistribute the means of production once capitalism has been replaced. It's the same end goal, but with very different means. Whereas Marx and Engels argued for the inevitable revolution, which Luxemburg also bought into, Webb is arguing for a democratic approach to it. So let's talk about human nature. Beatrice Webb does argue that our psyche, our our nature has been damaged by capitalism, that it does instill values of greed and selfishness in human beings rather than a collective mindset. But she rejects revolution. She believes that a violent revolution would only make things worse and leave scars on the human psyche. So, what humanity needs is to be gradually guided back to their true human nature. So again, we've got the same view as Marx in that our natural state is not one of greed and selfishness and individualism, and that a world is possible where our true qualities can flourish. But for Webb, a revolution would make things worse. And the peaceful, gradual transition would have a much more positive effect than a revolution. And Webb does buy into the concept of social class and the means of redistributing wealth to support the neediest in society. She doesn't see it as simply as Marx or Luxemburg may in the case of a bourgeoisie and a proletariat. For Webb, it's more complicated than that. And remember that Webb is a middle class intellectual socialist, what some people would refer to as a champagne socialist. Webb is somebody who buys into the values of socialism but doesn't belong to the proletariat that Marx identified. So for Webb, capitalism does create poverty and injustice. It does create social classes, and that depresses all of human potential. It doesn't just affect the proletariat, as Marx called them, it affects all of society. And as long as capitalism was there to depress the majority of citizens in the way that it does, human progress would be limited. Okay, finally, the state and this gradual move, this peaceful, democratic transition from capitalism to common ownership. For Webb, universal suffrage was absolutely important. And she's writing at a time when, certainly before the end of the First World War, not all men have the right to vote. Never mind female suffrage. So when Webb talks about universal suffrage, she's talking about all adult males and females. And if you can imagine Webb's perspective, if we go from a world where we go from middle-class men voting to both men and women of all social classes voting, the electorate is going to change dramatically. And that, in Webb's opinion, is what is going to lead to the success of the Labour Party, or socialist political parties in general. If the proletariat, as Marx called them, if the working class made up most of the electorate, they would be more likely to vote for socialist political parties who have their interests at heart. Because you have, in Webb's view, the Conservative and Liberal parties who are both trying to appeal to middle-class men, whereas the Labour Party was broadening its appeal to, at the minute, the disenfranchised. So, the idea for Webb is that if we give everybody the right to vote, the Labour Party or democratic socialist political parties all over the world will win elections. But it won't just be that group that vote for those parties, because soon enough, everybody will begin to see through the gradualist approach how much better the world can be when capitalism is replaced with common ownership. So as the economy, as the state begins to gradually move from the capitalist world to one of common ownership, what people will see and what people will realise is that actually that is a better world. For Webb, a managed economy, a planned economy, will not have those peaks and troughs, that volatility that capitalism has. And everyone will be able to identify that in the grand scheme of things, that is a better world to live in. And so, as social democrat parties are being elected or I should say democratic socialist parties. As democratic socialist parties are being elected and re-elected, as people are starting to see the positive impact of electing these parties, the state can then gradually change and move away from capitalism to common ownership of the economy, state control of industry, and control of the means of production, redistribution of wealth to those without it. And what that will do is that will give Webb the same endpoint as Marx, which is common ownership of the economy rather than private ownership. But Webb's way of doing it is gradual, is peaceful, is democratic, and will avoid what she thinks the scars that revolution will leave on our human nature.